in the dying days of the Old West, when the frontier was slowly surrendering to civilization, but wild hearts still beat in the vast expanses of untamed land, there lived men who found their truest companions not among their own kind, but in the four-legged creatures that shared their solitary existence. This is the story of such a man, a rancher whose world revolved around the magnificent beasts he raised, whose silence spoke louder than words, and whose guarded heart had been locked away for so long that he'd forgotten the key even existed. But what happens when the very thing you treasure most becomes the bridge to something you never knew you needed? What happens when a crime becomes a gift? When a thief steals not just your prized possession, but something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous to lose? Sometimes the heart chooses its own path, regardless of law, logic, or the careful walls we build around ourselves. This is the tale of John Taylor, a man who thought he knew exactly what mattered most in life, until a moonlit night changed everything he believed about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of home. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The sun was setting over the Montana Territory in shades of amber and rust, painting the endless grasslands in colors that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. John Taylor stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, a steaming cup of coffee growing cold in his weathered hands as he watched his horses move like living poetry across the pasture. 23 head of the finest quarter horses this side of the Rockies, each one worth more than most men saw in a year of honest work. At 38, John had built his life with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned not to trust in things that could disappoint him. His ranch, the Double T, sat on 800 acres of prime grazing land that he'd won in a poker game from a desperate gambler 5 years earlier. The house was simple but well built, with thick log walls that kept out the winter wind and a stone fireplace that had warmed many solitary evenings. But it was the horses that truly mattered. John moved among them with the quiet confidence of a man who spoke their language better than he spoke to most humans. There was Thunder, his prize stallion, a magnificent black gelding with intelligence burning in his dark eyes and power rippling through every muscle. There was Starlight, a Palomino mare with a coat like spun gold and a temperament as gentle as a summer breeze. And there were 21 others, each with their own personality, their own quirks, their own place in the carefully ordered world John had created. "Easy there, girl," John murmured to Moonbeam, a young filly who was still learning to trust human hands. His voice was rough from disuse. He might go days without speaking to another person, finding all the conversation he needed in the soft whickering of his horses and the whisper of wind through the grass. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and that was exactly how John preferred it. People meant complications, expectations, disappointments. People left, betrayed, died. Horses were different. They were honest in a way humans rarely managed, loyal without ulterior motives, and they never broke promises they'd never made. As darkness settled over the ranch like a familiar blanket, John made his final rounds of the evening. He checked the water troughs, secured the feed barn, and walked the fence line with the thoroughness of a man who knew that vigilance was the price of keeping what you loved. The Montana Territory was still rough country, despite what the newspapers back east might claim about the taming of the frontier. Rustlers, claim jumpers, and worse still roamed these lands, and a man with valuable horses was a natural target. John's hand rested unconsciously on the Colt .45 at his hip as he completed his circuit. The gun was well maintained and had been used more than once to protect his property. He'd killed 2 men in the past 3 years, both rustlers who'd thought an isolated rancher would be easy prey. The local sheriff had ruled both shootings justified, and John felt no guilt about them. In this country, a man protected what was his, or he lost it to someone who would. The ranch house felt particularly empty as John settled into his evening routine. A simple dinner of beans and cornbread, eaten in silence while he planned the next day's work. A quick check of his account books, noting with satisfaction that his breeding program was generating a steady profit. A few minutes reading a month-old newspaper that had arrived with the last supply run to town. But as he prepared for bed, something nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite identify. The horses seemed restless tonight, more so than usual. Thunder had been pacing the fence line earlier, his ears constantly swiveling, as if listening for something just beyond the range of human hearing. John stepped out onto the porch one final time, his bare feet silent on the wooden planks. The night was clear, with a quarter moon providing just enough light to see the dark shapes of his horses scattered across the pasture. Everything appeared normal, but the feeling of unease persisted. "Just your imagination, old man," he muttered to himself, using his voice for the first time in 2 days. But as he turned to go back inside, a sound drifted across the night air, the soft creak of leather, the almost inaudible whisper of careful footsteps in grass. John froze, every sense suddenly sharp as a blade. Someone was out there, moving through his property with the stealth of a practiced predator. His hand found his gun without conscious thought, and he melted back into the shadows of the porch, becoming as still and watchful as a hunting cat. The sound came again, closer now, and John's jaw tightened as he realized the intruder was heading for the main corral where Thunder and the other valuable breeding stock were kept. A horse thief, on his land, threatening the only things in the world that truly mattered to him. The rage that filled John Taylor was cold and absolute, like winter moonlight on snow. He'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, built too carefully to let some thieving stranger steal his life's work. Moving with practiced silence, he made his way toward the corral, his gun ready and his heart filled with deadly purpose. What he found there would change everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, about solitude and connection, about the careful walls he'd built around his guarded heart. But in that moment, creeping through the darkness toward an unknown enemy, John Taylor was still the same man he'd been for 5 years, a rancher whose horses were his life, his love, and his only family. That was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The figure moving through John's corral was smaller than he'd expected, but no less skilled for that. In the silver moonlight, he could make out a slender silhouette working with practiced efficiency to slip a halter over Thunder's head. The big stallion, usually suspicious of strangers, seemed surprisingly calm under the intruder's gentle hands. John raised his rifle, drawing a bead on the thief's center mass. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Step away from the horse and put your hands where I can see them." The figure froze for just an instant, then exploded into motion with a grace that surprised John. Instead of running, the thief vaulted onto Thunder's back with fluid ease, using the big horse's body as a shield while urging him toward the open gate. "Damn fool thing to do," John muttered, impressed despite himself by the stranger's horsemanship. But Thunder was his prize stallion, worth more than most men's entire spreads, and John wasn't about to let him disappear into the night. The chase that followed was unlike anything John had experienced. The thief rode Thunder as if they'd been partners for years, guiding the powerful stallion between fence posts and around obstacles with supernatural skill. But John knew every inch of his property, and he'd been riding since before he could properly walk. On Dusty, his most reliable cutting horse, John pursued the thief across the moonlit pasture, gradually closing the distance. The stranger was good, maybe even better than good, but Dusty was fresh while Thunder had been running hard, and local knowledge counted for something. The end came suddenly and violently. The thief tried to jump Thunder over a creek that was wider than it appeared in the darkness. The big stallion's hooves caught the far bank, sending both horse and rider tumbling into the muddy water below. John was off Dusty and splashing into the creek before Thunder had regained his footing. His first concern was for the horse. A quick examination showed no serious injuries, just some cuts and bruises that would heal with time. The thief, however, was a different story. "Well, I'll be damned," John breathed as he knelt beside the still figure sprawled in the mud. It was a woman. She was unconscious but breathing, her long dark hair plastered against a face that was younger than John had expected, maybe 25, with high cheekbones and full lips that suggested both strength and vulnerability. Her clothes were practical riding gear, worn but well-made, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who worked with horses regularly. More importantly, she was hurt. Her left leg was bent at an angle that made John wince, and blood seeped from a gash on her forehead where she'd struck a rock during the fall. John Taylor had always prided himself on being a practical man. The sensible thing to do would be to tie the woman up, throw her across Dusty's saddle, and ride into town to turn her over to Sheriff Morrison. Horse theft was a hanging offense in Montana Territory, and this woman was clearly guilty as sin. But as he looked down at her unconscious form, something stirred in John's chest, something he thought was dead and buried along with his capacity for human connection. Maybe it was the way she'd handled Thunder, with obvious love and respect for the animal. Maybe it was the vulnerability of her still form in the moonlight. Or maybe it was simply that he'd been alone for so long that any human contact, even with a horse thief, felt like a gift. Stupid, he muttered to himself as he carefully lifted the woman from the creek. Stupid and dangerous, and probably the worst decision you've ever made. But he made it anyway. John carried the unconscious thief back to his house, Thunder and Dusty following like loyal dogs. He settled her on the narrow bed in his spare room, a space that hadn't been used since his brother's last visit 3 years ago, and began the careful process of treating her injuries. The head wound was messy but not serious. The leg, however, was definitely broken. John had set enough horse bones over the years to recognize the signs, and while human bones weren't exactly the same, the principles were similar enough. "This is going to hurt," he said to the unconscious woman as he prepared to set the brake. "But I suppose you've got bigger problems to worry about than a little pain." Working by lamplight, John cleaned and splinted the broken leg with the methodical care he'd normally reserve for one of his valuable horses. He cleaned the head wound and wrapped it with strips torn from an old shirt. By the time he was finished, dawn was painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The woman stirred as John was washing the blood from his hands, her eyes fluttering open to reveal irises the color of storm clouds. For a moment she looked confused, disoriented, but then awareness flooded back, and her body tensed like a coiled spring. "Easy," John said, raising his hands to show he meant no immediate harm. "You took a nasty spill. That leg's broken, and you've got a concussion. You're not going anywhere for a while." The woman's eyes darted around the simple room, cataloging exits and potential weapons with the instincts of someone who'd lived dangerously for a long time. When her gaze finally settled on John, it was with a mixture of wariness and calculation. "You're not the sheriff," she observed, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested she wasn't entirely recovered from her ordeal. "No," John agreed. "I'm the man whose horse you tried to steal." "Ah." The woman's lips curved in what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "And I suppose you're planning to collect the reward for my capture?" John studied her face, noting the intelligence behind her eyes and the way she held herself despite obvious pain. "Depends," he said finally. "What's your name?" The woman was quiet for so long that John thought she wasn't going to answer. Then Charlotte Wild. Even isolated as he was, John had heard of Charlotte Wild, the Ghost Rider, some called her. The woman who could steal a man's prize horse from under his nose and disappear like smoke on the wind. She was wanted in 3 territories for horse theft, and the bounty on her head was enough to buy a small ranch. "Well, Miss Wild," John said, settling into the room's single chair, "it seems we have a situation here." Charlotte's storm-gray eyes never left his face. "What kind of situation?" "The kind where you're laid up in my house with a broken leg, and I have to decide what to do about it." "And what are you thinking of doing about it?" John Taylor looked at the notorious horse thief lying helpless in his spare bed, and realized he had absolutely no idea. All he knew was that turning her over to the law felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain, and that for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely alone. "I suppose," he said slowly, "we'll figure that out together." 3 days passed in an uneasy truce that felt more like a careful dance between predator and prey, though which remained unclear. Charlotte Wild proved to be a difficult patient, chafing against her forced confinement like a wild mustang in a too-small corral. But she was also surprisingly helpful, offering practical advice about horse care and ranch management from her bed with the casual expertise of someone who'd lived around horses her entire life. "You're Black Stallion," she said on the morning of the 4th day, accepting a cup of coffee from John's weathered hands. "He's favoring his right front hoof. Probably picked up a stone during our little adventure." John paused in the doorway, surprised. He'd noticed Thunder's slight limp himself, but hadn't mentioned it to anyone. "How could you tell from in here?" Charlotte smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth John had seen from her. "Listen, he's not putting his full weight down when he walks to the water trough. The rhythm's off." John found himself listening, and sure enough, Thunder's hoofbeats did have an irregular cadence that spoke of discomfort. It was the kind of detail that only someone with an exceptional ear for horses would notice. "I'll check it after breakfast," John said, setting a plate of eggs and bacon on the small table beside Charlotte's bed. "You should also rotate the breeding schedule for your mares," Charlotte continued, attacking her breakfast with the appetite of someone who was finally feeling better. "You're pushing Starlight too hard. She needs more recovery time between foals." This time John actually stopped and stared. "How the hell do you know about my breeding program?" Charlotte's expression became guarded again. "I watch. I listen. It's how I've stayed alive this long." Over the following days, John found himself drawn into increasingly complex conversations about horse bloodlines, training techniques, and the subtle art of reading equine behavior. Charlotte had an encyclopedic knowledge of horses that rivaled his own, combined with insights that could only come from years of working with animals under challenging conditions. "You learned all this stealing horses?" John asked one evening as they discussed the finer points of breaking mustangs, among other things. Charlotte's tone suggested that particular line of questioning was closed, but John caught something in her expression, a flicker of old pain that reminded him of his own carefully guarded secrets. As Charlotte's strength returned, she began helping with small tasks that could be accomplished from her bed. She mended tack with nimble fingers, sorted through his tangled records with an eye for detail that impressed him, and even taught him a few tricks for reading weather patterns that he'd never encountered before. "Where did you learn to forecast storms like that?" John asked after Charlotte correctly predicted a sudden thunderstorm that caught the local weatherwise ranchers completely off guard. "My grandmother," Charlotte said softly, her eyes distant. "She was half Cherokee, and she taught me to read the sky the way most people read books. Said the wind would always tell you the truth if you knew how to listen." It was the most personal information she'd shared, and John found himself treasuring it like a rare coin. Charlotte Wilde was revealing herself in layers, each one more complex and intriguing than the last. But it was when she finally convinced John to let her hobble out to the corral that her true nature became clear. "You shouldn't be putting weight on that leg yet," John protested as Charlotte leaned heavily on the makeshift crutch he'd fashioned from a broken fence post. "I'll be fine," Charlotte replied through gritted teeth. "But Thunder won't be if you don't get that stone out of his hoof soon." The big stallion, normally suspicious of strangers, walked directly to Charlotte as if drawn by an invisible thread. She spoke to him in low, musical tones, part English, part Cherokee words that John didn't understand, and part pure emotion that transcended language entirely. Within minutes, Charlotte had Thunder calm and compliant, allowing her to lift his hoof and examine the problem. With a small knife borrowed from John, she carefully extracted a sharp piece of shale that had wedged itself deep between the hoof and shoe. "There," she said, releasing Thunder's leg and scratching behind his ears. "That should feel better, shouldn't it, beautiful?" Thunder whickered softly and nuzzled Charlotte's shoulder with obvious affection. John stood transfixed, watching this notorious horse thief gentle his prize stallion with a skill that bordered on supernatural. "How do you do that?" he asked quietly. Charlotte looked up, her storm-gray eyes meeting his. "Horses don't lie," she said simply. "They don't scheme or betray or pretend to be something they're not. If you approach them with honesty and respect, they'll give you everything they have." "Unlike people," John said, and immediately wished he hadn't revealed so much. "Unlike most people," Charlotte agreed, her gaze searching his face. "But not all." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who'd both been wounded by human betrayal and found solace in the honest company of horses. John felt the careful walls around his heart shifting slightly, like ice beginning to crack in spring. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Charlotte finally began to tell her story. "I wasn't always an outlaw," she said, her voice barely audible over the evening breeze. 3 years ago, I was married to a man named David Wild. We had a small ranch in Colorado. Nothing fancy, but it was home. We were building something together, something good. John waited, sensing there was more. David had a gambling problem, Charlotte continued, her hands clenched in her lap. He hit it well at first, but eventually he bet away everything we had. The ranch, the horses, even my grandmother's jewelry. When he couldn't pay his debts, some very unpleasant men came calling. What happened? They killed David, Charlotte said flatly. Shot him down in front of our house, while I watched from the window. Then they told me I had 1 month to come up with the money he owed, or they'd kill me too. John felt something cold settle in his stomach. How much? $2,000. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. Charlotte's laugh was bitter. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stole a horse, a valuable one, and sold it. Then I stole another and another. Turns out I had a talent for it. And the men who killed your husband? Got their money, eventually. But by then I discovered that I was good at being an outlaw. Really good. And there's a certain freedom in it, you know. No one to answer to. No one to disappoint. No one to trust who might betray you. Charlotte turned to look at him directly. So that's my story, John Taylor. I'm a thief and a fugitive, and I probably always will be. The question is, what are you going to do about it? John looked into those storm-gray eyes and realized that his answer had been forming for days, building like pressure behind a dam until it could no longer be contained. I'm going to ask you to stay, he said quietly. Charlotte's eyes widened in surprise. Stay. You understand horses better than anyone I've ever met. You've got skills I could use on this ranch, and... John paused, struggling with words that felt foreign on his tongue. And I'm tired of being alone. John, Charlotte said softly, you don't understand. There are people looking for me. Bounty hunters, lawmen, worse. If I stay here, I'll bring trouble down on you. Let me worry about trouble, John replied. I've been handling my own problems for a long time. Charlotte was quiet for several minutes, her gaze fixed on the horses moving like shadows across the darkening pasture. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. You're offering me something I never thought I'd have again, she said. A home. A chance to be something other than what I've become. But John, you need to understand, if I stay, if we do this, there's no going back. You'll be harboring a fugitive. You'll be choosing my side against the law. John Taylor looked at the woman who tried to steal his most precious possession and ended up stealing something far more valuable, his carefully guarded heart. The decision should have been difficult, should have required careful consideration of consequences and risks. Instead, it was the easiest choice he'd ever made. Then I guess that's what I'm choosing, he said simply. Charlotte's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, and John realized that his kingdom of solitude had just become something infinitely more precious. A home shared with someone who understood the language of horses and the healing power of honest love. But even as they sat together in the gathering darkness, neither of them noticed the glint of sunlight off a spyglass from the distant ridge, where a patient bounty hunter had been watching the ranch for 3 days, waiting for exactly this moment. The trouble John had been expecting arrived 6 days later in the form of dust clouds on the eastern horizon. Charlotte spotted them first, her trained eye immediately recognizing the purposeful movement of riders who weren't just passing through. 3 men, she said, lowering the spyglass John kept for watching distant cattle, moving fast and heading straight for us. John felt his gut tighten as he studied the approaching riders. Bounty hunters? Most likely. Charlotte's voice was calm, but John could see the tension in her shoulders. They've been patient, probably watching to make sure I was really here before making their move. The riders were still 20 minutes away, but John was already moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd faced trouble before. Can you ride? With this leg? Not well and not far. Charlotte hobbled toward the house, her makeshift crutch tapping against the porch boards. But I can shoot if it comes to that. It won't come to that, John said grimly, checking the loads in his rifle. Not if I have anything to say about it. The bounty hunters rode into John's yard with the swagger of men who believed the law was on their side. Their leader was a tall, lean man with cold blue eyes and a badge pinned to his vest, a territorial marshal with the authority to arrest fugitives anywhere in Montana. Marshal Crawford, the man announced, staying mounted while his two companions flanked him. We're looking for Charlotte Wild, wanted for horse theft in Colorado and Wyoming territories. We have reason to believe she's on these premises. John stepped onto his porch, his rifle held casually but ready. This is private property, Marshal. You got a warrant. Crawford smiled without warmth. Don't need a warrant to arrest a known fugitive. Now, you can make this easy on yourself and tell us where she is, or we can search every building on this ranch until we find her. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested for harboring a fugitive, Crawford replied. That's a federal offense, Taylor. You could lose everything, your ranch, your freedom, maybe even your life if she's killed while resisting arrest. John felt Charlotte's presence behind him, knew she was listening from inside the house. The smart play would be to step aside, let the law take its course, and go back to his quiet life among the horses. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but as he looked at Crawford's cold eyes and thought about Charlotte's smile when she worked with Thunder, John realized that going back to his old life was no longer possible. She'd changed something fundamental in him, awakened feelings he'd thought were dead and buried. Well, Marshal, John said quietly, I guess we have a problem. Crawford's hand moved toward his gun. Don't be a fool, Taylor. She's just a horse thief. No woman is worth throwing your life away. You're wrong about that, John replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a thunderstorm. Crawford went for his gun, fast as a striking snake, but John had been expecting it. His rifle spoke first, the heavy bullet taking the marshal's center mass and punching him backward off his horse. The two remaining bounty hunters reacted with professional speed, but they were caught off guard by John's decisive action. One managed to clear leather before John's second shot dropped him. The other surrendered with his hands high, smart enough to recognize when the odds had turned against him. Jesus, the surviving bounty hunter breathed, staring at his dead companions. You killed a federal marshal. I killed a man who drew on me on my own property, John corrected. Big difference. Charlotte emerged from the house, moving as quickly as her injured leg would allow. She knelt beside Crawford's body, checking for signs of life that weren't there. He's dead, she confirmed unnecessarily. John, do you understand what this means? You can't stay here now. They'll come for you. John looked around his ranch, the home he'd built with years of backbreaking labor, the corrals where his horses grazed peacefully, the simple house that had sheltered him through so many lonely nights. Leaving would mean abandoning everything he'd worked for, everything he'd cared about before Charlotte entered his life. Then we'll both leave, he said simply. John, no. Charlotte gripped his arm. This is your home, your life's work. I won't let you sacrifice it for me. You're not letting me do anything, John replied, his voice gentle but firm. I'm choosing to do it. There's a difference. The surviving bounty hunter, a nervous man named Peters, was eager to bargain for his life. Look, I don't care about the woman, he said quickly. Crawford was the one with the hard-on, for bringing her in. Let me ride out of here, and I'll tell folks she died in the shooting. Clean slate for both of you. John studied the man's frightened face. And Crawford? Killed resisting arrest while trying to aid a fugitive, Peters said. Happens all the time out here. Nobody'll question it, especially once they hear Crawford drew first. It was a way out, John realized. Not perfect, but workable. Crawford's reputation for violence would make the story believable, and with Charlotte officially dead, the bounty hunters would stop coming. What about the ranch? Charlotte asked. John had already thought of that. Sell it to my neighbor, Henderson. He's been wanting to expand his spread for years. Take the money and start over somewhere else. We start over, Charlotte corrected. Together. John looked into her storm-gray eyes and saw his future reflected there. Uncertain, dangerous, but infinitely more meaningful than the safe solitude he was leaving behind. Together, he agreed. 2 hours later, Peters rode away with his story, and John began the process of erasing his old life. He selected the 6 best horses from his herd, including Thunder and Starlight, and prepared them for travel. The rest would go to Henderson along with the ranch. That evening, as they sat on the porch for what John knew would be the last time, Charlotte reached for his hand. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "Really sure? Because once we ride out of here tomorrow, there's no going back." John looked at his horses moving through the twilight, at the house he'd built with his own hands, at the woman who'd stumbled into his life and changed everything he thought he knew about love and sacrifice. "You know what I realized today," he said. "For 5 years, I thought this ranch was my life. I thought the horses were all I needed. But I was wrong." "What do you mean?" John turned to face her fully. "The horses were just practice. They taught me how to love something completely, how to care for something more than I cared for myself. But loving you, that's the real thing. That's what I was preparing for all along." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, John Taylor, more than I ever thought possible." They rode out the next morning as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. John didn't look back at the ranch he was leaving. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the horizon and the woman riding beside him. Behind them lay everything he'd built in his old life. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the constant need to stay one step ahead of the law. But Charlotte was with him, and somehow that made all the difference. His horses had been his life, until a thief came at midnight and stole his heart instead. And John Taylor had never made a better trade. 5 years later, in a small valley in Oregon Territory, where federal jurisdiction was more suggestion than law, John Taylor, now going by the name James Coleman, stood in the doorway of a modest cabin, watching his wife Charlotte work with a young colt in their makeshift corral. Their ranch was smaller than the Double T had been, and they ran fewer horses, but it was theirs in a way the old place had never been. Built together, defended together, shared in the true partnership that only comes when 2 people choose each other against all odds. "Easy boy," Charlotte murmured to the colt, her voice carrying the same musical quality that had first captivated John in his old corral. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The bounty hunters had stopped coming 2 years ago, convinced by Peter's story and the passage of time. Charlotte Wild was officially dead, and James Coleman was just another rancher trying to make a living in the far territories. Thunder, now showing gray around his muzzle, whickered a greeting as John approached the corral. The big stallion had adjusted to their new life with the resilience of a creature who trusted his humans completely. "How's he doing?" John asked, nodding toward the colt. "He'll be fine," Charlotte replied, scratching the young horse behind his ears. "He just needs to learn that not all humans are his enemies." "Sound familiar?" John smiled, remembering his own journey from isolation to trust. "Very familiar." As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that never failed to remind John of that first evening when Charlotte had told him her story, he reflected on the choices that had brought them here. He'd given up his ranch, his name, his entire old identity for love, and he'd never regretted it for a single day. Charlotte moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his with the easy familiarity of a couple who'd weathered storms together and emerged stronger. "Any regrets?" she asked, echoing his thoughts. John Taylor, James Coleman, looked at his wife, their horses, their small but perfect home, and smiled. "Just one," he said. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I regret that it took you so long to try to steal my horse," John replied. "We could have had 5 more years together." Charlotte's laughter echoed across the valley, and John realized that some thefts were really gifts in disguise. The greatest treasures weren't the ones you guarded most carefully. They were the ones that stole themselves into your heart when you weren't looking. His horses had been his life, until love taught him what living really meant. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.